comes home from school, I tell my dad, hey, stop watching whatever you're watching, I want to play on the PlayStation, or I want to watch a cartoon or whatever. I can't remember exactly what it was. And then I remember looking up and I saw a replay of one of the planes hitting the Twin Towers. And as a 9-year-old who was already reading some fairly advanced stuff and who was beginning to understand how the world functioned and reading into philosophy and this kind of stuff, even if it was like a little more apt for children. Effectively, all of this brought me back to really identifying as French, engaging in French politics and wanting to understand this. And then eventually I realized that most of the international coverage of French politics is crap. Who hasn't received a death threat from an anonymous person, right?
Like, put up your hand who hasn't.
Listen.
I don't think I have yet, but...
Oh, you haven't?
Welcome to the next episode of Beyond the Bubble. It's a pleasure to have here a political analyst and commentator with a substantive Substack, Julien Hoez, who has been writing the French Dispatch for quite some time, that he will share some insights about, but not so much on the form, but rather the substance. Meaning he is an analyst of French politics, of European politics, of global affairs, and I think there is quite a bit to talk about, no matter when this episode airs. And with that, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to our channel and put the little bell on the YouTube so you get notified when a new episode comes out. And if you have questions, comments, suggestions for guests, please go ahead and pitch them to me, to us. So with that, Julien, thanks for coming.
Well, thank you for having me.
So was it an accurate description of what you do?
I think so. I mean, the problem is there's so much that I actually do on my day-to-day that any description will fit something in some way, shape or form. So yeah.
Right. So how did you get to analyzing French politics besides carrying a French passport?
So, I mean, there's a very interesting thing in France where we have potentially one of the largest foreign diaspora in the world. I can't remember the exact figure, but it's somewhere in the millions, I think somewhere near 10 million. And the reality is that there's a lot of structures being put in place and that have always been put in place for maintaining this connection between the French diaspora and mainland France. You know, you have the French schools that can be found on every corner of the world. You have the consulates that are very, very active just about everywhere in maintaining relationships with the local French citizens wherever they are in the world. You now have the Maison Française that hosts a lot of cultural events and all this kind of thing. And finally, we are one of the few countries in the world, I think, next to Romania, you know, Italy and these kind of countries, that actually have MPs that represent every single French person on the planet, including even Antarctica, I think. So as a French person, you always have a very good connection with your country and your culture, and you always have access to information about what's happening, you know, entre guillemets, back home. Even if you're like me, you grew up in London, you went to English schools, and your connection was mostly your parents, your family in France, and going back every once in a while.
So how did that get you into following French politics? Because I think a great pitch for your newsletter is that it's an English newsletter about France and about European politics, which is somewhat rare, I would say, because there are probably a couple news outlets out there that cover France on a daily basis in English, but something that's more analytical and focusing on this particularly important country in Europe is rare.
So it all kind of comes back to my childhood, actually. So I had this very interesting political awakening. Well, I say it's interesting to me. I'm not sure if it's interesting to anybody else. But basically, I remember going home at one point. I think I was 9 years old. And I saw my dad was like sat in front of the television, you know, shocked by what was happening on television, on what was happening in the world. And I remember walking in. I did the thing that every 9-year-old does when he comes home from school. I tell my dad, hey, stop watching whatever you're watching. I want to play on the PlayStation, or I want to watch a cartoon or whatever. I can't remember exactly what it was. And then I remember looking up and I saw a replay of one of the planes hitting the Twin Towers. And as a 9-year-old who was already reading some fairly advanced stuff, and he was beginning to understand how the world functioned and reading into philosophy and this kind of stuff, even if it was like a little more apt for children. I was absolutely fascinated by what was happening. And I ended up just scouring all the news sources I possibly could to figure out what was going on. I was seeing a lot of references to the mess that was occurring between France, Germany, a lot of the European states and the US in terms of not wanting to get involved in what the US was getting involved in back in the day. And this pushed me to start watching more news and to really start looking at everything that was happening in the world and to start, looking at channels like TV5 Monde or, the various French channels that existed at the time. And my dad was also frequently bringing home French newspaper because he was always very much of the idea that you had to always read to develop personally and to understand what was happening, that you absolutely have an obligation to know what's going on. We're talking about parents who taught me about the values of the Republic when I was a kid. And this developed into me becoming very interested in what was happening in France because in the UK has its curious, interesting problems when it comes to immigration. I never really had a particularly strong British accent, so I very clearly came across as foreign. And when the World Cup, the Euros came around, I was always in a French jersey and all this kind of stuff. And so at the same time as this was happening, I was often being told that I should go back to my country, that old French people smell like trash, go take a shower, you people are cowards, white flags, blah, blah, blah. And all of this came to not only reinforce my identity as being French, effectively pushing me towards the French political side of things because I was still involved in British politics, but it also pushed me to really aggressively start getting involved into French politics when I could. Because obviously London's a big city, I was in one of the suburbs. And this kind of started with me becoming a member of the Jeunes UMP or whatever it was called back in the day, so Chirac and Sarkozy's old party. Eventually developing into me taking a slightly more active role in French politics. I ended up becoming an independent for a bit when Sarkozy went completely off the rails after he got his ass handed to him by Hollande in the 2012 elections. And throughout this entire process, throughout my self-education in politics, I just realized that for me, France was home, so I needed to care about what was happening at home because I had a French passport. I was a migrant. The UK, while London was my home and I consider myself a French Londoner, for me, it still wasn't quite my home, and I always felt more at home when I was in France, speaking French, engaging with family, friends over there, etc., right? Effectively, all of this brought me back to really identifying as French, engaging in French politics, and wanting to understand this. And then eventually I realized that most of the international coverage of French politics is crap because people just don't understand it. And it's complex, and then...
I'll interject here for a second. So what do you think is that most journalists or observers miss about France?
So I feel like people rely a lot on stereotypes quite often, so there's two issues. So firstly, French history is very long and complex. It's very fascinating. It's very rich. And it's one of the countries that I believe has potentially one of the more interesting histories of all of the revolutions, with all of the wars, with all of the societal upheaval, with all of the developments of the different regimes. Pardon me. And especially even the historical depth. You can go back to Charlemagne and you'll find some aspect of French society that still exists today in some way, shape, or form. My favorite fact is that the oldest French law in effect is from the 1500s, which is basically banning Latin from all legal texts, which you don't think you need that today, but you apparently do. But I think the issue as well, and this is one thing that I'm always trying not to do with the French Dispatch, is that a lot of the time the people covering French politics abroad are French themselves. And because we're a very politicized country, and we're a people who care a lot, and I don't think I have to explain that to anybody, we care a lot about a lot of things.
Intensively.
And the problem is that when you when those are the journalists who are bringing forward, their biases, their political positions, it starts skewing things in various directions, right? And this is something that I think sort of pulls the wool over people's eyes. And this is where you see, for example, The Local, which is a great publication run by James Savage. The more interesting coverage for a while was mostly coming from non-Francophones, because they were covering the nitty-gritty of what's happening in France for an audience that lived in certain regions, which was honestly brilliant. And was one of the inspirations that I had for launching the French Dispatch, because I figured, people keep asking me to cover French politics on Twitter, on Facebook, on whatever was the social media of the day back in the day. Why don't I just do it this way? And, I'd already had friends harassing me for years to say, stop putting your ideas for free on Twitter, try to do something with it because it's better for you and better for everybody else.
How much are you analyzing or just covering what happened or giving your own take on it or opinion on the events?
So, you can't get rid of personal bias. You can do as much as you can. You can get an editor who will, remove as much as possible. But I think there's still value to seeing the personal biases of people, because this is how you understand that person and where they're coming from. To be honest, I think it's quite clear to most people that, I'm not trying to hoodwink anybody about my political positions.
How do you define yourself politically?
I'm a social liberal, a Republican in the European sense, well, in the French sense, I guess. You can probably call me a Macronist, because that's where my positions basically landed, and, the right candidate at the right time came for me to milite for and all this kind of stuff. And I'm also a federalist, because I see the value in the European project. I see the need to do all of this kind of stuff. But when it comes to how the division between covering and analyzing really depends on the story, because I try to make a good mix of, current events and the really big stories like, Macron's supposed pivot on Taiwan or China and why this was bad or important, good and important or unimportant or whatever. But people want to know the smaller stuff. So, for example, I got a lot of really positive feedback from a lot of Parisians who read my publication on the fact that I covered the fight between the Mairie de Paris and local residents who were unhappy that they'd extended the opening hours for terrace in Paris by an hour, which is something that I don't think people would really care about. And yet people really, really cared about that story.
Even outside Paris?
Even outside Paris. Because they see
Why so?
They see it as an extension of what's happening in their own cities and in their own environments, right? People... So this is kind of the really beautiful thing about current events and news coverage and the way cities are developing, not only within Europe, but globally, right? People see what's happening in Paris and they'll either go, I really want that to happen here, or I want that to be kept as far away from me as possible, right? And it's the same whether you look at, the trash collection system here in Brussels is an absolute atrocity. So people are always saying, well, why don't we do what they're doing in Copenhagen or Amsterdam or even Tokyo or whatever, right? Because they see all these stories developing. And there's sort of this shared consciousness that's developing where we're sharing the experiences that we have in our cities and our own personal lives. And thanks to the magic that is the internet, so long as Donald Trump doesn't shut it down at some point because he's mad we didn't give him a Tootsie Roll or something, we can share these experiences and inform other people and actually draw inspiration from the stories of other people, And like you see this in like the most, I don't want to say banal, but in some of the most simple ways, right? Like look at how Instagram and YouTube have become places where people share poetry that people across the world will have never heard of, right? Like you're actually influencing another person by sharing a poem or a story that touches you quite deeply. And this is the kind of thing that we're seeing in the political sphere too. Politicians are taking inspiration from each other in public as well as in private, in like the conferences of mayors and what have you that happen, right?
So to some degree, you're unearthing stories that you think would resonate even if people have no direct interest in that particular place. Yeah. But to say, well, here is what something happened in Besançon, and that's of interest to someone in a different region but with similar attributes.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of these things where even if it's not directly applicable or useful to someone right now, there is such a thing as becoming generally knowledgeable, right? Like developing general knowledge, figuring out how to pass information, how to, store this information, how to use it later on. It's always helpful. But a lot of it, again, it also comes back to the fact that it's also just interesting. We like to know about things. We like to know about other people.
And I think that's where you come in, and those of your mindset come in, because you are an editor as much as a writer, because you pick those interesting stories, and if you keep it up consistently and your readers reinforce it, well, then it's a good digest of the information, because there's such an overload, and I don't want to necessarily trust the algorithms to serve up whatever I want to see, but I would trust certain individuals or authors or creators and say, well, you do that curation of the news and you pick it and give your analysis. And I may not agree with it occasionally or more than occasionally, it doesn't matter. As long as I find it interesting and valuable and good faith, I think that matters.
And I think the good faith part is really the thing that really comes in the most when you're talking about, I guess you could call me a content creator at this stage, just to simplify it for people, where you find some content creators who they don't manage to really penetrate or develop a brand or a following or whatever. More often than not, because they're not perceived as acting in good faith, or they're not seen as they're being genuine, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that there's something to be said about the fact that people want this kind of genuine engagement and development of content and sharing of content. Because, for example, one thing that people have told me, and again, this is something that I try to do quite often, and it's gotten me into a lot of trouble in my political career. But as much as we were joking about this earlier, that I'm a big fan of Jean-Luc Mélenchon and Marine Le Pen and Donald Trump and all these awful politicians, that despite the fact that I clearly have a political position that's been delineated and that's very clear, right? That has never stopped me from reporting or explaining the bad things that are happening within my political party or within my political movement or within the European federal movement and all these kind of things, right?
So you wouldn't be taking that sort of filter to say only the ones I strongly oppose politically, I'm going to focus on that, but more the analyst part, and say, okay, whatever happens on my side of the field, I will be just as open about it.
Yeah, because this is how it's supposed to be, right? This is critical thinking 101. You don't just take something at face value and say, I really like that guy. Such a big fan of Macron, he can do no wrong. No, everybody makes mistakes. Everybody screws up. Everybody can be blinded by various events coming at them at random directions. I was very vocal, for example, when he made a colossally boneheaded move and dissolved the parliament in France, right? And after we, as a party, had just, come second, I think, or third or whatever, and we weren't doing too hot, and public opinion was definitely against us, doing this is basically throwing your own party to the wolves, right? And I have contacts across the board in France, whether they were the far right or far left or the PS or Renaissance or Modem or whatever. Nobody thought that was a good idea. Even the people who benefited from this, like the far right. And I do keep contact with some people in DRN because it's people that have ended up there that I used
just to spell out the names for our listeners. Yeah,
DRN is the Rassemblement National, so Marine Le Pen's soon to be Marine Le Pen's former party, and soon to be Jordan Bardella's party. But nobody thought it was a good idea. Everybody thought it was a dangerous idea that actually created chaos in the political system. And the more we try to explain bad decisions and mistakes away, the more we try to pretend that people are infallible. And the more that we weaken our own positions and our ideas and our mental capacity by pretending that everything is black and white, then the more society as a whole is going to start collapsing, which is
what we're seeing.
What we're seeing right now. And it's I don't want to contribute to that at all. Yeah. That's not what I want my life to have.
I think that's a worthy effort of nuance. And more sophisticated analysis, and also the good faith and the honesty, where you say, well, this was a big mistake when you call it out as such. But tell me more about the trouble you got yourself into.
Oh, no, I got a lot of complaints about the fact that I was a bit too outspoken against my own party's positions. I mean, I got into a couple of fights, verbal fights, over the fact that I was against the fact that they forced through the pension reforms using Article 49.3, which is basically, to keep it very short, in the French Constitution, the Prime Minister is allowed to force through legislation ignoring the typical legislative procedure.
Almost like an executive order.
Kind of, yeah. But they do it they basically gamble on the survival of the government. So it's usually done when there's going to be gridlock in the legislative procedure, or they're losing too many key components of a piece of legislation that they really pushed for, that was their platform or whatever. Pardon me. And what they do is they force it through. And the reason why it's a very unpopular move is that you have the Prime Minister typically will go up on stage in the Assembly and will say, I think it's on the reputation or the dignity of my government, I'm employing Article 49.3 to push this piece of legislation through immediately. And they do it that way because, one, Charles de Gaulle didn't like the fact that back in the 50s or something, he tried to make a piece of legislation that imploded completely. And it's what led to him quitting in the first time when he was first the head of the government. And so he changed this when he created the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. And also it's because if the Assembly doesn't agree and everybody votes against Article 49.3, then the government basically dissolves immediately. And then the president has to nominate a new prime minister based on the consultations with the parties. They have to form a government. It's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. And basically I had disagreed several times, quite passionately. One, on doing this on the pension reform, because I saw the problems coming a mile away. I mean, you don't take something that's unpopular and you just shove it through. Because, I mean, for example, they're having consultations.
What was the pension reform about? Lowering the pension age?
No,
raising,
Raising the pension age and changing the system in some ways with a combination of points and all this kind of stuff. And the reason it was very unpopular is because people in France are quite attached to a healthy, very, very healthy work-life balance.
I was curious how you rephrase it, but
I was too.
Yes,
but
I saw that the vocabulary was running over an overdrive in your head. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and it's something that I understand and I sympathize with quite well. But the problem was that obviously the populists got involved very aggressively. Like you had the far left, La France Insoumise, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and the far right, Rassemblement National, led by Marine Le Pen, who both said this is unacceptable, we can't do this. Obviously, when Marine Le Pen was pressed on whether if she won legislative elections, she would roll it back. Oh, no, we can't talk about it right now. We're not going to do that. No.
Let the others take the unpopular measure.
Exactly. And basically, there was that. And also on the dissolving of the election, I got into a couple of debates with some party colleagues about the fact that it was a boneheaded move that should have never been contemplated. Because I think if it had been done, because it's also messed up the political calendar a bit, I think, where normally in French politics you have the presidential elections and then the legislative elections. So usually you get a confirmation of the presidential vote in the second vote. Quite simple. Now, if I'm not wrong, it's now going to be presidential election, then 2 years, then legislative elections. So now we're going to have a weird sort of a midterm election for the legislatives, which is going to get quite messy. Unless they figure out a way of doing it to put it back in the original structure it was.
So the next presidential is 2027.
Yes.
2 years from now.
Yes. And theoretically, the legislatives will be in 2029, which could be quite complicated, because then you have the European elections and the legislative elections happening within 2 weeks of each other, which will get quite messy, I think. But yeah, so this is the kind of trouble I get into because I'm very opinionated. And again, I think it's important important to actually be sharing these views, as opposed to doing what lots of people do and just sort of attaching yourself to the nearest person who you think is going to drag you up through the ranks and get you elected.
Well, when you say you're opinionated, so how does that come together with your analyst hat? Because an analyst is analyzing with the best of care and nuanced views, but you say you have strong opinions. So do you separate that and to say, well, this is how it is, and I personally very much oppose this, or I think it's a good idea, or here's what I see from my vantage point?
So there's two ways that I approach it. So in one way, sometimes if it's something where the facts aren't necessarily clear, I'll usually write what the analytical and the objective reality as we know it at that stage is, which is, if they do X, it is believed that they will lead to Y, Z, A, B, C, whatever, what have you.
Yeah.
But I believe that there is still a potential for problematic outcomes based on my knowledge of X, Y, Z, blah, blah, blah. Because I'm opinionated. I will never contest that, and I don't think anybody could either, to be honest. But my opinions are entirely based on facts and truth. Like, my feelings... what is it that Ben Shapiro used to say to people all the time? Like, facts don't care about your feelings. Yeah, exactly. And, facts don't care about my feelings either.
Yeah. One thing I would say to that is the proportion or the intensity that we attribute to certain facts will vary based on your worldview, your values, often your feelings and all the rest. So if you say, well, here is one piece of legislation, is that truly as important as I consider that to be? Well, for me, it could be, and for another person is completely irrelevant.
Yeah. And in this case, again, this is where my mixing of my analytics and my opinion will come in, right? Because I can easily say, like, for me personally, I think that strategic autonomy has been the single most important policy platform since de Gaulle's time.
Right.
Because
let's talk about that a bit. It's a very interesting concept, and I'm very curious to hear your take, because it's an often talked about term, strategic autonomy, of France, of the EU, against the rest of the world, against the United States. What does it mean with NATO? What does it mean with China? What does it mean with the rest of the world? So let's hear your take in a nutshell.
So, I mean, it's one of these things where it depends on if you're taking it as a realist, if you're taking it in the military, in the civil sense, in the technological sense, whatever. I mean, I think it should encompass everything. But the reality is that we can't... Look, God, how am I actually going to explain this in a simple way? We live in a dangerous world, and we were kind of lulled into a sense of full security for decades because we saw that America was the big responsible guardian. Sure, it went off the rails once or twice with like Suez or, Contra or whatever. But the reality is that we were lulled into a full sense of security where everything was going to be hunky-dory. You were going to have healthy, friendly competition with everybody. Russia was going to become democratic. China was going to become democratic. We're all going to be holding hands, saying kumbaya. The UN is going to be amazing. It's going to be a great time, etc., etc. The reality is that if we look at the analysis that was being done by academics in the 80s, and the 90s, and the early 2000s, there were alarm bells everywhere. And it wasn't helped that the more popular scholars like Fukuyama, who with his end of history and all this kind of stuff, and then he was kind of pushing everybody out of the discussions, and people also had a bit of they had a very bad reaction to Huntington's Clash of Civilizations things. And we ignored the signs that things weren't as good as they were believed to be, right? I mean, you just have to look at how the debacle of the UN when it came to the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq and that mess, where America just kind of disregarded everybody's opinion, said, hey, Britain, do you want to come along and have a good time in wherever? And then triggered an absolutely insane 2 decades of war. Well, potentially now 3 decades of war at this stage because, Trump's getting a bit hairy in Iran.
Yeah,
but
we'll see how that plays out.
It's not going to be good. But we always have this view that things are going to be fine, whereas things are fine because we make an effort to ensure that they're going to be fine. And we have had a big issue in Europe where we've kind of rested on our laurels, partially because of, I mean, the only word that comes to mind is paresse, so like laziness, I guess. Complacency. And the fact that everybody was thinking, trade will solve all of our issues, diplomacy will solve all of our issues. And we kind of all forgot that we are supposed to be competing, right? Whether that's in defense, where we should have our own military industrial capacities and not be reliant on a country that's not necessarily going to be our friend forever, as we've seen for the last 10 years now. We need to be able to have strong French, German, whatever, European technologies and companies are able to ensure that jobs stay in Europe and that we're able to actually make the most of our intellectual capacity and our genius and our academic, capacity, because we've got a continent of a few 100 million people. There are some really, really smart and very, very creative people on this continent who, for some reason, can't seem to compete with people abroad, and who find themselves hamstrung by whatever it may be, whether that's, political decisions or too much regulation or poorly written regulation and what have you, right? And a big part of the problem, to be entirely honest, was the French. Because we have a bad reputation for being very opinionated, for having a very strong position on everything. And I spoke about this with Dave Keating a few weeks back, actually. We've always been pushing this idea of strategic autonomy, of ensuring French independence, and then after that, for European independence, and then making sure that we were able to actually keep ourselves safe, because we saw what happened when the little green men from Russia invaded Crimea. No one did anything. And we saw what happened with the repeated wars in the Middle East, where we got left in the lurch when it came to the evacuation of Kabul or what have you, right? And over and over and over and over again, usually it was the French saying, we shouldn't be so dependent on the Americans, we can't keep doing this, we need to be doing our own thing. But then two things would happen simultaneously. One, we'd say, hey, do you want to buy some Rafales? And then everybody's like, no, look, we've got the F-35s or F-16s or whatever. We don't need to buy your plane, which costs a bit more. And there was also this overwhelming fear that strategic autonomy for France always meant buy French. Because in Europe, we're one of the bigger military equipment producers and constructors and all this kind of stuff, right? Which I think was quite unfounded, and I've had many a debate on this. But also the fact that it was seen as a weird form of French anti-Americanism that was kind of leaking over from the post-Iraq, the post-9/11 period where, France didn't want to be in NATO because they didn't want to be under, the American decision-making process. They didn't like being in the UN Security Council because the Americans were swinging their metaphoricals around. You had the situation where there were always diplomatic fights between France and America over just about everything that could happen in the world. And the fact that America was getting a bit antsy on the Europe and China issue and all this kind of stuff even 20 years ago. And this all contributed to the French position on strategic autonomy, which is, making sure that Europe can fend for itself, that there are strong European businesses, industries that were limiting the access of Americans and foreigners to our data, to our information, to our funding structures, to the position of head of trade for the European Commission, even if that person is friends with von der Leyen, But this all contributed to the fact that every time, at least under Macron, and I'll focus more on this period now, every time there was a proposal made, it always took 5, 6, 7 years to get anywhere. Because I don't know if you remember the Sorbonne speeches that happened in 2017 and 2021, where basically everything we're doing now, as in right now, or that we've done in the last 6, 7 years of European politics, every single thing that has been done can be traced back in some way, shape, or form to one of Macron's speeches in the Sorbonne.
10 years ago or 9 years ago?
2017, and then again he repeated a lot of it in 2021.
Okay.
Because he was saying, things are hitting the fan aggressively. We need to really make this work and we need to change this. Of course, there was then the issue of the Germany topic, where Merkel didn't necessarily buy into Macron's positions. You then have the political system with the parliament that needs to debate and discuss, and then trialogues and all this kind of stuff, right? But it's ultimately the strategic autonomy that I view is very much a French one. But the French view on strategic autonomy is European by nature.
Yeah,
it's just that
it cannot be otherwise.
Exactly,
because France, in and by itself, is unable to really deliver the strategic autonomy. However powerful the French military is, and however powerful the French economy is, in a global sense, it's nothing.
Yeah,
and it's only something,
even
so if it's all together with the EU27.
And it's also complicated by the fact that there is also a weird aversion to the fact that the powerful member states who can really deliver on strategic autonomy to a strong extent, because they have the intellectual capacity and the citizenry, the industrial capacity that they can either ramp up or just maintain. There's always this fear in some of the smaller member states that the bigger member states will just take over, right? And basically force them out of the discussions or force them out of the industrial running. And to be fair, I don't think enough has been done to assuage those fears, right? The Germany, France, the twin motor of the European Union, or even like Poland now with the Weimar Triangle and all this kind of stuff, which is a military alliance combination of France, Germany, and Poland. They haven't done enough to tell the smaller member states, we're not going to stop you from having jobs or factories in your territories, right?
Yeah.
Because a big part of it as well is making sure you can actually have jobs for Europeans working on key industries while also arming the European militaries.
Yeah. I think to me, there's a lot of paralysis. So much, what you're talking about is essentially the lack of trust, and a lack of, trust is also about believing that what you're claiming or promising me, you're going to deliver on that. And without that trust, which is so essential for anything long term, things are not going to move, and that slow advancement, to the degree it's an advancement, it's endangering the continent in so many ways. You look at, even if you take the military away, you take digital. I mean, Europe is just in an awfully bad place when it comes to digital.
It's a terrible place.
It's in a terrible place, and we're so exposed to China, to the US, especially when it comes to cloud computing or AI and all the rest, that it's crazy. And despite the fact that France has, hosted the AI summit a couple months ago, it has Mistral, the only AI that we have here. But again, where's the data stored? Where's the data being processed? Typically not in Europe. Perhaps technically on some servers here, but the actual added value, the real sophistication is not happening here.
Yeah. And there was also I can't remember what it was called, but do you remember when we tried to set up that cloud storage system like back in 2017, 2018, I think it was called like Gaia or something.
There was something like that.
Do you remember? And people started.
I remember the search engine that was not quorum.
No, it's
something with Q, a Latin query quorum,
which is still used.
Oh.
I don't use it, but it's still in use.
It actually came to be.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, no, but we have a lot of search engines in France. I think we're the number one producer in Europe of search engines at this stage, to be honest.
Okay.
But the problem is that we always end up launching these ideas, like it was Gaia X or something. The whole thing fell apart because no one wanted to fund it. No one could agree where to keep the data storage centers. No one wanted to take ownership of it, and every time someone tried to take ownership of something, the other member states would say, no, not you. It was absurd. The whole situation was an absolute mess. And
just to take a kind of political science/philosophy sidetrack, if you think about it, that level of fragmentation, it leads either to some inner dictator or strongman, usually not woman, but strongman rising up and uniting it with all the wrong tools and the wrong reasons, or some external one imposing their will on us. And that doesn't look good. I mean, that sort of fragmentation when they debate, is that going to be in country X and country Y, or region X or region Y? Yeah, those are important, but in the grand scheme of things, when everybody is basically the sum of the whole is less than the whole because it's so fragmented.
And it's one of these things that it's why I can understand why people have or are losing No, because people have a lot of faith in the European Union as a project, but I can understand why people have a lack of faith in the processes. Because it doesn't make sense that we can develop these structures and that we can develop these ideas and then they just die because of bickering.
Fade away.
And it's absolute nonsense. Like, think of it. This was, we're 2025 right now. It was 8 years ago. In 8 years, we could easily have built a couple of data centers that could have already been starting to scale up.
8 years is eternity when it comes to digital.
Yeah, especially when it comes to the legislative process in Europe. But,
no, we simply don't have the time for that. And again, it's not just digital. You take military capabilities. Yeah. You take procurement for that matter.
Yeah.
All of those things are extremely important. They are in the works. They are being discussed. They are being improved, but step by step and slowly.
And it doesn't make sense because we know that it's urgent, and we've seen that the institutions can move quick in Europe. Like we've seen that in the last 3 or 4 years since the institutions, since Russia invaded Ukraine, right? And since everybody realized that this plus Trump is a bad combination, the institutions started moving quickly on several dossiers. The munitions, whatever it was called back in the day, the decisions on funding the Ukrainian military and their equipment, on actually funding military sites across Europe. Now they're talking about the military transport dossier and everything, right? They can move quickly if they want. But to go into European political philosophy, it then leads to, it only occurs in a way that then leads to the European Union becoming a bit more state-like, where the heads of state are saying we need to do this at all costs.
So how do you see that with your federalist hat? Because I've been hearing a lot of criticism against the current European Commission president, who is criticized for centralizing things, for driving things much more in her own hands, and others would claim that it's not so democratic and not so transparent. So to a large degree, I don't have a strong opinion on this, but to a large degree, that sort of trend has to happen if we are to act as a unified bloc in some way. But reconciling that with democratic principles and procedures is the very difficult thing, and everybody with their taste, because something that is ultra efficient is called dictatorship, but often makes efficient but the wrong decisions, whereas democracies are by definition slow, and that can sometimes expose them to those outside risks.
Yeah.
And if we take a step back and again, you look at France, looking at not so much the protests per se, but that sort of trend where those in power and Macron and the political leadership right now, if they are judged to be doing a bad job to the degree that either the far left or the far right comes into power, how do you see that possibility and that way of things playing out?
So we have a very interesting media environment in France, where even media actors have a political bent to them. So in France, you have, how do I say this? So you have CNews, which is typically seen as being far-right. And now you have a Journal du Dimanche, which is now owned by Bolloré, who is pretty far-right himself and quite conservative in general.
By far-right meaning aligning with the Le Pen agenda? Or
Le Pen, I think he was quite fond of Zemmour, who is crazy dude. And you have people on CNews like Pascal Pro, who is frequently made fun of because you can have a story about, how do I put this? There was a story like a few weeks back where they were talking about the fact that, there weren't enough spaces in some areas for summer schooling for kids who needed a bit more support or who wanted to go to summer camp or whatever. And this guy, who is quite close to Zemmour, very close to Zemmour, he went on TV and said something ridiculous like, oh, but how has immigration and the Arabs impacted the availability of summer schools for French kids? And it's like, dude, what are you doing? But you also have the same thing on the far left, where you have people who are very much engaging in the discourse that you see from Jean-Luc Mélenchon, right? Like whitewashing Maduro, whitewashing some of the actions in some authoritarian countries, wherever, talking about how sometimes we should take inspiration from these countries because, we need to experiment and discover new things, right?
So communism,
yeah,
and a lot of totalitarian,
yeah,
and a lot of Islamist agenda as well, no?
See, the Islamist agenda, I think, in what we see outside of Europe is way overblown. Like, you have bad actors in general, right? You have people who are constantly whitewashing poor behavior or talking about their inspiration from whatever religion, whatever you want, right? And I think it's been overblown more now because of obviously the Israel-Palestine situation, the fact that it's become so politically toxic. So you've got one side takes one side, the other side takes the other side, and let's fight in the middle and just keep fighting, right? But there's been a lot of political, in this case, I'll say, entre guillemets, efforts, because I think everybody heard about this famous report that came out with Bruno Retailleau, so the current interior minister, a Républicain who's currently trying to position himself for 2027. He just won the presidency of the party a month ago.
This is the Muslim Brotherhood report?
The Muslim Brotherhood report, where if you actually read the report, I mean, you could have basically asked ChatGPT, hey, write me a report in the conditional tense on a potential penetration of the Muslim Brotherhood in France. And at one point there's a series of lines that says, these districts in Europe, in Brussels, could be the centers of penetration in the Belgian state and could present a danger to the French Republic or whatever, right? And there's a problem where people are getting too emotive on the topic, right? And I think in general in Europe, you can see a problem with just about every single religion's extremists and fundamentalists. Like
proportions are very different because obviously the number of Buddhists or number of whatever religion you take is very different. And again, we're not talking about Islam as a religion, but as a political project where you have a very strong anti-Republican agenda for large groups of people, and that is a concern to the Republic itself.
Sure, but we also have that from the Catholics and the Christians. So there's also a tendency over there.
I'm not sure it's such a visible / pertinent phenomenon.
Sure, but it's not as visible because it's not being reported on as much as it should be. So there's currently a big movement in France for a restoration of the old monarchies and bringing it back to France to being a good Catholic Christian country, blah, blah, blah.
Is it also anti-Republican or it's more of a cultural...
100% anti-Republican.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some content creators that are getting more and more popular who are basically creating and selling all these old monarchic flags. I know one guy took part in a long march in this world pilgrimage of the old monarchy, which was like a road that was ridden along by the kings of France at some point, or blah, blah, blah. Okay. And it's a current that's always existed. And this kind of brings us back to why pushing forward on republicanism, not just as an ideology, but as a way of life, I guess, to not go in that direction too much, is so important because you've got people who are falling to religion, whatever it is, because they're lacking something in life, right? Or they're being indoctrinated by parents or family or whatever.
Or they are seeking some spiritual
Or they're seeking some spiritual addition. And yes, there's political parties that will excuse behavior that shouldn't be excused. Like, for example, you've got... There was an event that happened a few weeks back or a few months back where a bunch of Muslim kids beat up this Jewish person, right? And obviously everybody was deeply shocked. My great-grandpa during the war was a Jew, so, I know how this stuff goes out of control very quickly from my own family's experience, right? And this kind of situation was, a bit whitewashed by the far left, while the Parti Socialiste was sat there going like, what the hell is nobody arguing against this? You had the far right who went berserk saying, we have to defend the Jews from the evil Muslims and all this kind of stuff. The center were, like usual, just prosecuting everybody they could and make sure that it was investigated. And on the other hand, you had a situation where a young Muslim boy was killed by far-right I think he was a far right fanatic or whatever. And then you had the opposite happen, where you had the far left who was saying, "Oh, the far right are so dangerous to society. How could they kill this good Muslim boy?" And then the far right would like, "Well, what about Israel?" And it's like we've gotten to the stage where we in France have a very good security system. You know, whether it's the DGSI, so internal security, DGSE, the external security, who are picking up on a lot of the dangerous behavior happening in France, quite often being funded by the Russians. So the Russians hired some kids from a banlieue over Telegram and got him to tag all of these synagogues in Paris, which was the images people saw late last year of the synagogues being tagged, right? And things are being pushed in certain directions by external actors quite often, and quite often internally, we're not necessarily fixing the problems that are leading to people seeking out this kind of life, right? Whether that's poor education.
I mean, one thing is for sure that Jews in France are leaving the country in unprecedented numbers because they don't feel safe. And again, you can debate a lot the reasons and social trends, but this is usually the canary in the coal mine phenomenon to say an exposed minority is not feeling safe, then what does it say about the larger societal trends?
Oh, I agree. I mean, I don't have the figures on that specifically, but I know that I think the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Israel called on Jews to return to Israel not too long ago. They were calling on French Jews to leave France because of the situations happening there. And to be honest, I can't blame them for feeling unsafe. If these things are happening, and to be honest, I can't blame anybody for feeling unsafe if they're targeted based on whatever, characteristic, right? If we can't give them security, and if we can't make them feel safe, then we can't blame them for leaving, right? And the political discourse became too toxic. It's become too toxic. People are behaving in poor ways. There's abominable discourse happening, or quite often anonymously, which is a big issue in modern society in general, because who hasn't received a death threat from an anonymous person, right?
Put up your hand who hasn't.
Listen.
I don't think I have yet, but
you haven't?
Yeah. Well, I guess there will be an episode. Maybe this one, maybe some other.
Listen, we need to get those numbers
that
up.
will come.
No, please don't do that. Please.
Okay.
Like I've had to deal with more than my fair share of that kind of stuff, and to be honest, it's not.
And what triggered it?
What didn't trigger it? So I was getting a lot of death threats during Brexit, because obviously a French guy who's like pro-European and trying to say that Brexit's a bad idea, like.
And that was at a time when you were in London still? Or
I was in London. Okay. I was working for Gina Miller back in the day, so I was running her Brexit campaigns and helping her develop them and helping her work on all this kind of stuff.
Okay.
And I was also doing a lot of EU citizens' rights stuff, so I was helping out with the negotiations on the EU settled status for citizens living there, etc., etc. And I was also regularly on TV, on social media saying, look, this is a bad idea. Like, we shouldn't do this. We need to be...
Death threat.
100%. I had guys threatening my dad. And I was like, firstly, my dad will kick your ass because the guy's ex-military. And I was like, why? What the hell did he do? Like, it's...
No, we're laughing about it, but it can be serious.
Yeah, I've almost been run over like 4 times. So, and I've been involved... I've been caught in a crossfire in a shootout in my local hometown. So, You kind of become slightly numb to this kind of stuff. It freaks you out when it happens. Like, don't get me wrong, but you're still like, it. When you think back on it, nothing happened, so no harm, no foul, right?
Yeah. But again, going back to the French mood, political mood, do you really feel that it's extremely divided? Is it as divided as some other? Well, probably not as bad as in the US, I would guess, or I would hope. But how do you see French society going along?
So French society is it's not in a good place, I don't think. So obviously you have a lot of foreign forces who are engaging to destabilize the country, whether that's Russia, whether that's... there was an issue with Chechen mafia in France not too long ago who killed, I can't remember if it was the Chechens but there was mafia who killed someone based on something that happened back home or whatever. You have the obvious issue Israel-Palestine, and then you have the entire horseshoe is basically on fire at this stage, where you've got the far left and the far right winking at each other while talking about how damaging the country is, how damaged the country is in general. You even had Marine Le Pen saying, "Oh, me versus Le Pen in 2027 is very possible." Wink, wink, wink. And you have a situation right now where political instability, not helped by the boneheaded election last year, where you have a political spectrum that's split in three. So you have the left bloc, and heavily influenced by the far left right now, the far right bloc, and then the centrists, which is like a loose coalition of various people. And right now they're struggling to actually make it work. So our deputy
it being the country.
Yeah, so right now there's budgetary problems. The country narrowly avoided a credit downgrading from S&P Global, I think it was.
Standard & Poor's.
Yeah. You have the other rating agencies that are looking at the discussions on pensions right now and saying, what if you don't make this work, then this calls into question your whole debt strategy. The French state is quite indebted. And despite the fact that things are quite strong, I mean, you have Choose France, which is doing a huge job in getting in foreign direct investments into France, which I think is the number one destination in Europe right now. Despite the fact that you have burgeoning economies and burgeoning industries, so local economies, sorry. And despite the fact that you have a population that does want to make things work and that is actively trying to, make the best of things and that aren't poor by any standard, you still have a big situation right now where the country isn't in a good place. In huge part because the politicization of the media in general, whether you got the far right or the far left shooting their talking points everywhere, whether you have the political fights spilling out onto social media, whether you have people being blamed for X, Y, Z. And right now, the issue is that we don't know when exactly the shoe is going to drop. Because right now, so I'm just checking the dates, we're the 23rd, in about 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, the constitutional limits on dissolving parliament will end, and you're basically in open season for any potential elections.
So it's not a given that it's in 2 years?
No, so not for the presidential, for the legislative.
Or legislative.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the presidential elections, I think they can only be rerun if there is a... So if the president dies in office and he's then replaced by the Senate president, according to official protocol, the Senate president can technically organize presidential elections. And as far as I can see, Macron's not necessarily going to die anytime soon. At least I hope not, because the guy's got his life ahead of him. And so presidential elections will still be in 2027, but from July onwards, we could have legislative elections at any time. The problem with that is that there is a huge temptation to do that in the hopes that they can gamble and get a bigger majority for the centrists. The problem with that is that if rather than growing, they become smaller, then all of those votes are going to go either to the left bloc or the right bloc, which then leads to a bigger situation where people are going to potentially wish they hadn't done that stupid mistake a second time. And yeah, I mean, the country's not in a good place, basically, but they're trying to do the best they can. I mean, this is why they ended up putting forward the eternal challenger, François Bayrou, as the prime minister, who has been in French politics since the 70s. I mean...
He's always the jolly joker.
Yeah, exactly. He was the butt of a lot of jokes when I was watching Les Guignols de l'Info on television way back in the day, where he was considered the man who would never become president and all this kind of stuff. But and actually, funny enough, he's currently one of the better placed people to become president in 2 years.
As a compromise candidate.
If the centrists can get behind him, yeah. Because, I mean, Edouard Philippe is about to take another trial to the teeth. Attal is struggling.
How popular is the far left and the far right? Do you have any rough numbers in mind? Are they really the edge, or one or the other is becoming the main player?
So, I'm trying to think back to the last poll I saw. The last poll I saw had the far right as the first place. with whether that was Marine Le Pen if she somehow gets the appeal to overturn the ruling, which based on what we saw with Fillon and with Sarkozy, it's not going to happen. Or Bardella, he's quite popular, so I think he was number one. I think he was in the 32, 33 range. You had Jean-Luc Mélenchon for the far left. He's hovering at 7 to 9% in the polls.
Oh, okay.
But the problem is that Mélenchon is very good at bullying the other people, especially because for the last couple of sessions and legislatures, he's had the largest majority of MPs in the left bloc. Which is why the recent developments that I've been discussing on the French Dispatch with regard to the Socialist Party, which is still trying to figure out where to position itself, but has basically said it doesn't want to be involved with Mélenchon anymore, their work right now is quite interesting. Because what happens is, if Mélenchon sticks at 8 to whatever percent, and the entirety of the left then goes with either Olivier Faure, so the first secretary of the Socialist Party in France, or they go with a compromise candidate on the left, like it could be Hollande, so the former president, it could be Bernard Cazeneuve, so the former prime minister, or even Raphaël Glucksmann, who's an MEP right now and who's running his own micro-party inside the Socialists. They could do a lot better than they have in the past and actually win quite well. The problem is that they're trying to figure out what exactly they're doing in terms of primaries. Now, when you look at the polling itself and who's best placed to actually get to the second round, that's where it gets very messy. So it's expected that Marine Le Pen or Bardella, so her protege, and the phantom MEP that nobody ever sees because he just clocks in for his money and then clocks out and then goes home. If he runs, then the best candidates to beat him currently right now are either Edouard Philippe, so the former prime minister, and the current leader of a party within the presidential coalition called Horizons, which is like center-left, a bit Juppéiste, so a bit like the former prime minister Alain Juppé, or Gabriel Attal, who's the current secgen of Renaissance, my party, and who is the former prime minister and who is currently very popular. But the issue is that because of the fact that Attal is closer to the left, so he's more of a social liberal, and Philippe is more of a conservative liberal, there's a very weird dynamic where for some reason more people would vote for Philippe in a second round, and he sort of does a 50-50 against Bardella and like beats Le Pen, as opposed to Attal, who I think gets through to the second round and loses by 2 or 3 points, based on current polling. And the current situation politically in France is that people are so locked into their positions that the polling isn't really moving as much as we'd like.
So it's quite entrenched.
Yeah, it's quite entrenched, and it's not helped by the fact that the far right and the far left are riding the pro-Palestine train to the moon. And that doesn't help any of the other left-wing parties because they're getting lumped in with Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And, he's not necessarily helpful rhetoric to trying to fix the situation. And you have the far right who are just not saying anything. And they're completely staying out of everything. Because they're trying to wait to see if Marine Le Pen can run. There's a power struggle internally between the pro-Bardella faction and the pro-Le Pen faction. Even Marion Maréchal is thinking of coming in and taking over the party and then trying to run as president in 2027, which is going to be a bad idea, in my view. But it's not in a great place right now. And obviously, for some reason, people really dislike Macron. So,
and why, as a closing idea, why do you think Macron, if you look at his overall career over the many years, why do you think he has become so much less popular than he used to be?
So he made a few mistakes in talking. So he has a bad habit of relying on poetry. Relying on poetry and poetic verse to talk about people. So I think he quoted Molière or something once, where he was on a train and he was looking out of the window and said, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was something along the lines of regarde, c'est moins que rien, so look at these less than nothings, right? Which he was sort of quoting popular people, normal people, and this kind of stuff. And I believe he didn't mean it in as offensive a way as it comes across, but this was published across the media and he got ransacked. And there was a couple of other situations like this where he was in front of television cameras and someone came up to him when he was doing an interview and said, so I'm looking for a job, but I can't find anybody. Like, what are you doing to help people find jobs? And he said, oh, do you have your CV with you? And the guy went something like, yeah, sure. And he just said, well, I'll go with you across the street to every single shop here and I'll find you a job on the street. Sort of talking about the fact that maybe he needed to just go and apply more or do his share, and this went down like a lead balloon. And on top of this, he gets painted in a slightly unfavorable light when it comes to the supporting Ukraine situation, where you have the far right and the far left saying he's pissing money up the wall to support a war against Russia, who aren't our enemy, despite everything Russia has said about France. You have his unpopularity because of the fact that he dissolved parliament and created political gridlock. You have a lot of conspiracy theories about him. So that he's
and his wife,
which is complete nonsense. I mean, that.
We won't get into that, but
whenever I hear that stuff, I always think the internet was a mistake, to be honest. But no, he the fact that he's apparently a multimillionaire banker means that he should never have been a member of the Socialist Party ever in his life, right? Because he was just there to whitewash his reputation or whatever. And you always hear these you remember the old Illuminati conspiracy theories we always used to hear when we were younger, like the Illuminati secretly rule the world and all this nonsense, blah blah. Yeah. People honestly talk about Macron like he is a part of the Illuminati, that he helped make Pizzagate happen and protected the pedophiles and all this nonsense. It's the things you hear about.
I always love how much power they attribute to people, and then in the next sentence they say he's completely powerless, he's a nobody.
Right, exactly.
Right? On one side he is running the world secretly, and on the other side he's completly powerless.
Yeah,
and not just him,
he's being cheated on by his wife while he cheats on her with his best friend or something. It's all this nonsense. But there's a combination of a media environment that is always going to be targeting the president, because in France we don't like giving our presidents a tough time. Whether we talk about Chirac now in a positive light or Sarkozy, nobody's talking about Sarkozy in a positive light anymore, but Hollande or Chirac or Mitterrand or whoever, they will always get it in the neck 24/7 from the French media, the French population, and anybody
and the French dispatch.
And the French dispatch, because the fact that the French president, and then afterwards, 10, 20 years after they've left office, everybody's going to be like, you know what? He was a good president. And this happens every single time, except for Sarkozy, because he's a criminal.
Hollande also?
Yeah, people like Hollande a lot more than they did back then. But that's because he was the one who put forward austerity, right? So he was betraying socialism and selling out to the ECB, and he was Merkel's lapdog and all this kind of nonsense, right? And again, this plays to the fact that we keep constructing these discourses on political leaders, especially in France. And these political ideas about the leaders are being put in place by people who either in some way shouldn't, because they don't actually know enough, or they're just trying to sow chaos or whatever, or should be a little more well thought through. And I'm gonna drop a small bomb, because this could be a fun discussion for another time. But the whole anonymity in social media thing contributes to so much chaos that we need to find a way of making sure that people can actually be seen for who they are and that they can actually be found. Because you have people saying the most outrageous stuff and they just get away with it because they did it through a VPN with a random email address and an anonymous account, right? And this contributes to...
Well, there's also the proposal about kids not getting access to social media under 15.
Great idea. A great idea. Listen, if I hadn't gone onto the internet when I was younger, I wouldn't have gone onto 4chan and seen the shit I did. And kids don't need to be seeing that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Kids do not need to be seeing that kind of stuff. Kids do not need to be on social media. Kids do not need to be on Instagram. Just, they can let them have YouTube Kids or YouTube Teens or whatever,
Yeah.
Let's just make something nicer, whatever. Like,
that's a big conversation on its own. I mean, it shouldn't be a conversation because the problem is that ship has already sailed and it's very hard to put the genie back into the bottle.
Or worst case, what you do, tie it to your ID cards. You can be anonymous publicly, but there's always a record of who you actually are.
Yeah.
Because then if someone's literally sending death threats to random people, you report it to the police.
There's a consequence to your words and to your actions. And you're responsible ultimately, whether reputationally or beyond.
And I think that if we took a system like that, we would not only see a decrease in the aggressive and outrageous discourse that we're seeing in politics today, but we may even see a loss in the disinformation and misinformation space because foreign actors won't be able to as freely and easily create all of these accounts and attack our democracies.
On one side, I agree with you. On the other side, I'm skeptical because even so many mainstream publications have been just so co-opted by foreign interests and foreign narratives that even those are no longer bastions of truth.
Sure, but it's an iterative process.
Yeah. I'm not debating. It's just a partial tackling of the problem where even legacy news outlets and publications are just running nonsense these days.
Yeah, of course. But then that's another step of the process, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of these people are actually developing their processes and their reputations and getting these jobs using social media. I mean, it's like the crazy lady who used to work for The Guardian and the Wall Street Journal or something, who was talking about the fact that the French were tattooing barcodes onto Muslim kids to keep track of them because we needed to...
They don't?
No. No.
No. There is a narrative out there like that.
There was a narrative out there.
Okay.
And I, once again, received some very interesting threats because I said it was absolute nonsense and, please...
No, but that's the thing. Like, you can now claim anything and then the what is the word? The proof of...
The burden of proof.
The burden of proof. Yeah. So the burden of proof is then on you to say, no, I'm not a wife beater. I'm not a tattoo artist of Muslim kids in France.
And this is genuinely, also it's nonsense because we don't actually track this kind of data at the basic level in France. Like, we're not going to go around tattooing random kids. Yeah. Could you imagine? I mean, Jesus Christ, what are we? Nazi Germany? Come on.
With those happy words.
Yeah.
I give you a card to pull.
Sure. Should I go from the middle or should I go to the...
Wherever you wish. Yeah, whatever comes your way.
Do you have a technique for dealing with despair? So, I don't really deal with despair in general because I don't really feel despair. I don't know. I mean...
Despite being in the news business?
Yeah. I mean, despite being in politics even. I mean, for me... there's something you need to do in general, which is very much, firstly, having hobbies that make sure that you're not making your work your entire life and that you're actually living a life outside of it, right? And for me, whether that's dancing tango or running marathons or whatever, I always try to do fun things and do interesting things because that's how you refresh yourself and keep your brain active and young, I guess. But, I guess the main technique I have, if you can even call it that, is that I always try to be hopeful, like all French people. I'm always trying to stay positive. I'm always trying to see things for what they are. And I'm always trying to see the world for what it is. Sure, the world's on fire. But as per that famous, who sang that song? Billy Joel? The world's been burning since the world's been turning. This isn't anything new. People in the 80s and the 70s thought nukes were going to drop on their heads, The world always seems worse to the people going through it because we're seeing it immediately. And the world feels worse than it is today because of the fact that the information is overloading us constantly. And if you put that into perspective, if you understand that we've been in these places before, that there are people who are able to think through these situations and that there are checks and balances that are actually going to make sure that things don't spiral completely out of control, that we're not alone here, that we are actually able to have an influence in this, which I'll add a quick thing, get engaged in politics. It's very important. We don't need to feel despair because, even if things seem dark, even if things seem bad, even if things seem like they're going the wrong way, that's never gonna go on forever, right? Like you can be in the worst place in your life. That's going to end at some point. You can be in the worst situation you've ever had in your life, but you're going to find a way to get through that.
And I think the mindset is important there, because
Yeah.
if you strongly believe that you're going to get out of that, you will get out of that.
Yeah. And
Just keep going.
yeah, and there's this a mentality that I remember having drilled into me when I was younger and I was doing swimming and running competitions and boxing competitions and judo competitions. All of my coaches, no matter who it was, would always tell me, you need to, it sucks. You need to embrace the suck. You need to just keep going and just keep, because like life's hard. You don't have to make it harder by blowing it out of proportion, right?
So as an apt quote from my CrossFit gym on the wall, it's a Churchill quote, if I can say that to a Frenchman.
Yeah,
as a closing, it says, if you're going through hell, keep going.
Yeah, but it's true.
That's a good one. Yeah. Good stuff, sir. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Good luck. And note to everyone, sign up to the French Dispatch. We're going to link it in the show notes and promote it everywhere we can.